Hey, hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight and welcome to the Corner Society. As many of you already know, my name is Christy Slobogan and I'm an assistant professor of health humanities and bioethics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. And I've taken over the Corner Society this year from McCall Roz, who many of you also know, who's been chairing the Corner Society for the last several years. As usual, I'd like to give a small, short-ish background on the Corner Society before we get started. Dr. George Washington Corner was the first professor of anatomy at the University of Rochester. And in 1934, he organized a medical history club to provide opportunities for students and faculty to attend lectures and engage in lively discussion around a range of topics in the history of medicine. So today, the Corner Society continues that tradition of bringing stimulating speakers on diverse topics in medical history to Rochester's physicians, students, scholars, and community members. So I'm really grateful that these events can continue to take place, thanks to the generosity of the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics, the Paul M. Shivey Center for Bioethics, and the University of Rochester Humanities Center. And then this event in particular is also co-sponsored by the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Rochester Medical Center. I must also, of course, thank all dues-paying members of the Corner Society. If you are interested in becoming a paying member or donating, please do not hesitate to talk to me. I'd also like to thank Bob Riley and Larry Guttmacher for their continued.
I want to thank two women who have helped out.
Yes.
Kirsten and Susan.
Yes, absolutely.
From empathizers to AV.
Yes.
That's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you for your continued support of the Corner Society. It's really, really appreciated. And for those of you who haven't been to one of these talks before, they are always here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine at 5:30, usually 3 in the fall and 3 in the spring. And we have one more talk on this season's program. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't try to plug that to you all while I have you here. On Wednesday, April 16th, Bryn McBride from the University of University of Maryland will be presenting her work on photographic manipulation of patient images in early medical journals. I've seen Bryn speak before, and it's going to be a really fascinating talk. So I hope that a lot of you can make it to that one as well, April 16th. And we still have flyers for this season out there if you'd like to take one home. And now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker. I'm thrilled that tonight we have Michael Healy speaking to us about his research on the history of psychiatry. Michael is one of University of Rochester's own, having obtained his undergraduate degree here and now being a third-year medical student at University of Rochester. He also earned a PhD in the history of medicine and a graduate certificate in psychiatric epidemiology from Johns Hopkins University. He's presented his research to many different audiences, including actually the Corner Society about 6 years ago. So he's back again. And he's written for both historical journals and interdisciplinary periodicals. After obtaining his MD, Michael plans to pursue further training in psychiatry or in family medicine so that he can continue his exploration of the intersections between clinical practice and public mental health. So please join me in welcoming Michael Healy.
Thank you, Christy, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. Also want to thank the Corner Society and the Department of Psychiatry for co-sponsoring this event. Such a unique venue, and as Christy said, I was here 6 years ago, and it's always a treat to speak here, so thank you for coming. Can you hear me okay? Am I close enough to me? Okay. Cool. All right. So as Christy already mentioned, I recently completed my PhD in the history of medicine, where I focused on the development of psychiatric epidemiology as a discipline. While I was writing my dissertation, I also took several courses at the Bloomberg School of Public Health in order to learn a bit more about the current state of the discipline. There. One of the first courses I took there was, thank you. One of the first courses I took there was centered around Eaton Fallon's Public Mental Health, which is a standard text in the field. Now, as a pre-med here at Rochester, I always used to get distracted by the introductions to textbooks like these, where they would discuss the history behind the facts and the figures and the pages that would follow. I should have realized then that I was meant to go into history. And so it's not surprising that many years later, when I was in this class and I was assigned this chapter here, I found myself gravitating towards the highlighted section entitled Historical Background. It was here that I first learned of this periodization of psychiatric epidemiology's history, which I've since encountered in other lectures and articles. According to this popular schema, the field has progressed through distinct generations, each characterized by different methods and foci. The first of these is a bit beyond the scope of the presentation today, but suffice to say, my bad. This is a reminder to silence your cell phones. Okay. The first of these is beyond the scope of my presentation today, but suffice to say, it was characterized by the use of records from asylums and clinics, supplemented by observations made by key informants in the community. This stood in stark contrast to the second generation, which began after World War II. United under the banner of social psychiatry, a new cohort of physicians and scientists interviewed people directly in their homes, or rather trained students and entry-level professionals to do so for them. These studies could rely on lay interviewers and thus survey more people, partly because they weren't concerned with exact diagnoses. Instead, they used questionnaires or symptom scales designed to screen for non-specific conditions like impairment or dysfunction. Aided by early editions of the DSM, which consisted primarily of psychoanalytic descriptions, clinicians then distinguished cases from non-cases, allowing social scientists to identify which factors contributed to the former. All this changed during the third generation, which was prompted by the publication of DSM-3. As Hannah Decker and other historians have chronicled, this edition brought about a revolution in psychiatric classification. This too is beyond the scope of my talk today, but suffice to say that the psychodynamic concept preferred by Freudians gave way to more descriptive categories with a presumed biological basis, ones akin to those developed by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin decades earlier. Not wanting to be left behind, psychiatric epidemiologists, who increasingly identified as such, began replacing symptom scales with diagnostic schedules, a new sort of questionnaire that essentially walked the interviewer through the criteria of the DSM. Now, this doesn't mean that symptom scales disappeared entirely. In fact, I'm willing to bet that everyone here has been measured by one at some point. Are any of you familiar with the patient health questionnaire? Yeah, that's what I thought. So this is probably one of the most popular examples of a symptom scale today. It's certainly the one I use mostly in these talks. And even if you don't recognize it by name, you've probably filled one out in a waiting room before. Essentially, it's a short survey used to screen for symptoms of depression. The first question, pictured here, asks how often you felt little interest or pleasure during the last 2 weeks, and there are 8 more of those questions. You then select one of 4 standardized responses, each of which is assigned a numerical value. And after you answer all these questions, the clinician can count up your total score, and if it reaches a certain threshold, they then begin a full diagnostic workup. So this isn't diagnosis, it's screening. A diagnostic schedule, in contrast, is a tool that allows a researcher who may not be clinically trained to complete a similar diagnostic workup. And this is really important because it enables them to identify particular diseases among their study sample. For example, while the PHQ would reveal the rates of anhedonia or other symptoms in a given population, a schedule like the Prime MD, and you can see the relationship between the two there, would reveal the actual prevalence of major depressive disorder or related conditions in the same community. And so symptom scales continue to be used in primary care today, and that's depicted by this middle column here. I know that grayscale doesn't help with this, but and while the PHQ is the last one shown on this timeline, I'm sure clinicians in the audience can name countless more. There's so many. But this example is somewhat peculiar because the PHQ was developed after its corresponding schedule, that Prime MD I mentioned there. And thus the PHQ is very closely aligned with the diagnostic criteria of depression in the DSM. In contrast, most symptom scales, which are shown in white in this diagram, were developed before the DSM-3. And this partly explains why they were designed to measure the severity of symptoms as opposed to detecting particular diseases. According to this timeline in that schema from the other slide, too, such tools were rendered obsolete in psychiatric epidemiology, if not in practice. And that's represented by the column most to the right. And you can see there that the Health Opinion Survey, or HOS, which is an example of a symptom scale, was converted to the DPEX-1 and DPEX-2. These are 2 instruments that incorporate criteria of the DSM-3 and 4 respectively on that timeline. Other symptom scales like the 22-item scale or 22IS just disappear entirely. But in either case, the result is the same. As epidemiology, like psychiatry, moved away from psychodynamics, these flexible measures of symptom severity gave way to more rigid and standardized schedules, which are shown in black throughout this chart. Now, as an educator, I found periodizations like this or others to be very helpful when I'm teaching. So I taught a course in the history of psychiatry at Hopkins, for instance, and I used a similar generation framework as a sort of scaffolding, allowing my students to estimate or to situate rather individuals and events within a broader narrative. That being said, when I came across this schema as a graduate student, I felt it was a bit too neat. Outside of class, I've been analyzing records from the Phipps Clinic in Baltimore, which is one of the first centers for academic psychiatry in the United States. Between 1909 and 1941, approximately 250 clinicians and researchers worked at Phipps. Trust me, I've counted. 3 of these were cited repeatedly in the textbook on the previous slide, but I'll get to that in a second. Aided by his staff, this clinic's director, Adolf Meyer, developed a novel paradigm for psychiatry, which he dubbed psychobiology. Now, many see this name and assume it is some sort of predecessor to today's biological psychiatry. And indeed, Meyer did draw extensively from Emil Kraepelin's methods, those same methods I mentioned that were enshrined in the DSM-3 decades later. But he's also an early vehicle for Freudianism in the United States, insofar as he emphasized etiology and various psychodynamic factors. But the truth is that Meyer doesn't fit neatly into this dichotomy between Kraepelin and Freud, between nosology and psychoanalysis. He saw things a little differently. The biology in psychobiology refers to evolution. While Meyer was interested in the somatic basis of mental illness, he primarily thought of psychopathology as a maladjustment between an organism and its environment, and not just the physical environment. To Meyer and his followers, a patient's entire social context, from the home to the nation state, was within the purview of psychiatric analysis. Now, if you're sitting there thinking this sounds awfully familiar, you aren't alone. It was the similarities between psychobiology and the biopsychosocial model that drew me to Meyer in the first place as a Rochester undergrad and med student. And indeed, these similarities may not have been a coincidence. There's reason to believe Engel might have actually been influenced by Meyer and his followers. So many of you likely know that Engel went to medical school at Hopkins, and he would have taken a course on Meyer's psychobiology while he was there. Later at Mount Sinai, he actually worked with a psychoanalyst, Lawrence Kuby, who had also worked with Meyer at Phipps. But this is a bit of speculation on my part. There are certainly people here who know much more about this. It's not something I've really looked at extensively. But I have spent a great deal of time with 2 of Engel's classmates, Dorothea and Alexander Leighton. The couple received their MDs from Hopkins in 1936, just 2 years ahead of Engel. And they began residencies at Phipps soon after, but neither practiced psychiatry for very long. With Meyer's support, they began training as anthropologists 2 years later, so they could better explore the social determinants of mental illness. Now, as a medical student who had also taken a leave of absence to study the medical humanities, and I've also done some anthropological work, I was really interested in the Leightons when I came across them in my work. But I didn't appreciate the full significance of their work until I took a course at Bloomberg and saw them cited in my textbook as the prime examples of second-gen researchers. You see, after leaving Phipps, the Leightons took positions at Cornell University, from which they launched the Sterling County Study, an investigation of culture and mental illness in Nova Scotia. That's how I found myself spending a couple summers in Ithaca, combing through the records that they and their co-investigators left behind. I'll dig into those in a minute during the first half of this presentation. It was on Cornell's Manhattan campus, however, that I stumbled across the archives of another Meyerian, Tom Rennie. This Scottish-born psychiatrist was senior to the Leightons at Phipps. He actually would have taught psychobiology to them and Engel when they were medical students. He too was interested in the social determinants of mental illness. During World War II, in fact, he helped develop numerous programs aimed at readjusting traumatized veterans to their communities. Such efforts helped him secure the chair of social psychiatry at Cornell, which was the first of its kind in the country. From this post, he launched the Midtown Manhattan Study, another example of second-gen research from my textbook. Despite its locations, Rennie's project was designed very similarly to the one in Sterling County. Alex Leighton would even assume control of the Midtown study years later after Rennie passed away. I'll recount that phase of the study a bit more later during the second half of my talk. It should come as no great shock then that the products of these studies were very similar as well. Remember the HOS and the 22IS, the 2 symptom scales I mentioned before? They were created during Sterling and Midtown respectively, before being adapted for studies in many other populations. What may be surprising is that the DPACS, a diagnostic schedule, was also produced by Leighton's team, albeit years later. In fact, Sterling continues to this very day and has thus spanned 2 generations of psych epi. This begs the question, how could one study have adopted two distinct and seemingly contradictory approaches? Part of the answer can be found by returning to the source of the periodization from my previous slide. A 1981 lecture by the epidemiologists Barbara and Bruce Dorwin, the former of whom is pictured here. This is the talk that's summarized in the textbooks on the previous slide to provide students with a brief account of their field's history. When I sat down to read it for myself, however, I learned that the Dorwins' primary aim was not to document where Psych-Epi had been, but to suggest where the field was heading. Writing just 1 year after the publication of DSM-3, and that's key, they spent the better part of their lecture suggesting how this brand new classification system could yield new instruments for them, namely the diagnostic schedules I referred to earlier. But they did not, however, suggest that these replace the symptom scales of the previous generation. On the contrary, the Dorwins proposed a mixed methods study that utilized both sets of tools, as depicted in this flowchart. And I think that anyone who's done research in a field like this will understand how mixing these methods would be necessary. And the same as in clinical practice, you screen and then you diagnose. So why then do textbooks and lectures juxtapose these second and third gen methods, implying that the latter is an improvement on the former? It might be for the sake of simplicity, as contrasting one to the other helps students understand the intricacies of both. Having said that, I believe narrating the history of Psych-Epi in this way minimizes the importance of second gen methods. I'll discuss this more at the end of my presentation, but for now, I think it's fair to say that measures of dysfunction generally, in addition to the incidence and prevalence of particular disorders, have become central to development of mental health policy. Furthermore, I'd argue that these accounts, which emphasize the transition from a Freudian to a neo-Kraepelinian approach, obscures the influence of Meyer and his followers on both generations. This is something I've sought to correct with my dissertation, which follows the careers of Rennie and the Laytons. In the first 3 chapters, I recount their training at Phipps, as well as their experiences during World War II. However, in the last 2 chapters, and in my talk today, I examine their influence on Sterling and Midtown, and by extension, the emerging fields of psychiatric epidemiology and social psychiatry. While both of these subdisciplines were amenable to psychobiological concepts and methods, they tended to appropriate them in reductive and partisan ways. Towards the end of this presentation, I'll describe some of the differences that emerge between epidemiologists and their fellow social psychiatrists, and explain why the statistics of the former prevailed over the ethnography of the latter. The project as a whole explores the broader impact of Meyer and his followers on mid-century social science and public policy. Throughout, I argue that some adaptations of psychobiology equated mental health with economic productivity, while others analyzed social adjustment more broadly. While it is tempting to criticize the former and valorize the latter, I critique both approaches in an effort to inform current practices. To that end, I will conclude my talk today by discussing some contemporary analogs I have seen to these methods, although I'm hoping we could identify others in the Q&A. But before we get to all that, let me introduce you to the county in Nova Scotia where the first of these studies was conducted. Well, let me actually take a sip of water. Okay. So unlike Midtown and actually most second-gen studies, Sterling was in a rural community, not an urban one. As such, some concerns about urban communities at the time, like the pathogenicity of industrial work or mass consumption, they weren't as relevant here. Indeed, despite some modernizing influences, most of the county's residents made a living by farming, fishing, or logging. This preserved a stark but vibrant landscape that greatly appealed to Alex, who is pictured on the left. He actually regularly visited Sterling with his parents as a child. The county's demographics were relatively static as well, with most communities comprised of English-speaking Protestants or French-speaking or Acadian Catholics. To study these and other groups, the Laytons trained a group of students to visit locals in their homes and administer a standardized questionnaire. Even still, it would be impossible for the interviewers to knock on every door in the county. The Laytons then decided to divide the area into strata, each of which was characterized by different socioeconomic and cultural traits. Before they sat down with participants in their living rooms, the interviewers would use this form pictured here to covertly rate various aspects of the house. So they take a look at its size, for instance, and rate it from low to high, while the interior could be categorized as disorderly, average, or neat. These ratings of the house were coupled with questions about the participants' living conditions. So do they rent their house? How do they keep their food? Do they have a refrigerator? How do they wash their clothes? Do they have a washing machine? They could also ask about the perception of these living conditions in both relative and historical terms. So how does your standard of living compare to other families in the town? How does your standard of living compare to your family a few generations back? Questions like these were included to investigate the impact that various social factors had on mental illness, or more precisely, stress. The hypothesized relationship between these variables was depicted in diagrams like the one pictured here. In this way, the Laytons and their team had collected a very large amount of information about Sterling's families. But to determine which of these social factors were most associated with mental illness, they would have to be compared to an independent assessment of stress. And in the absence of laboratory tests or other biomedical metrics, the gold standard for diagnosing psychiatric disorders, then as now, was an examination by experts, namely psychiatrists. And so the Laytons recruited 3 psychiatrists from Manhattan, including Rennie, their former co-resident. Just like at Phipps then, the 3 psychobiologists reviewed each case with their colleagues, not to arrive at a diagnosis. After all, this was never Meyer's primary aim at his staff conferences, but to determine how well or adjusted each participant was. This was easier said than done. As these consultations dragged on, the 5 psychiatrists found themselves disagreeing more often than they expected. This was even true of Rennie and the Laytons, despite their shared background. The study's chief statistician actually noted that the reliability between these raters was unacceptably low, no better than tossing a coin. If the SES were to proceed then, if Sterling was to proceed then, a better method of case identification would need to be developed. The solution came from an unlikely source, the US military. During World War II, the Selective Service Agency had recruited an unprecedented number of psychiatrists to identify draftees that were unfit for combat. Out of these efforts came the Neuropsychiatric Screening Adjunct, or NSA, one of the earliest symptom scales. Subsequent research had suggested that the NSA could be used to screen for mental illness more generally. But the questionnaire had been developed for young, able-bodied men, not the general population. And so the Laytons had one of their doctoral students, Alistair Macmillan, administer to over 500 civilians and a couple hundred psych patients in 2 nearby counties to determine which questions were best suited for Sterling. Now, unlike other students the Laytons had, Macmillan actually didn't interview people directly in their homes. Instead, he bought this trailer pictured here, fitted it with basic medical equipment, and then acted as though he was conducting a general health assessment. Moreover, to avoid the stigma associated with psychiatric disorders, he decided to give this new NSA, this shortened NSA, a more ambiguous name, the Health Opinion Survey, or HOS. For the sake of consistency, the actual questions of the HOS cannot be revised or reordered. However, the Laytons, recalling their training under Meyer, felt that such a brief and targeted questionnaire would fail to elicit sufficient or accurate data from their participants. And so they decided to add a few questions to the beginning of the survey in hopes that it would help their interviewers mimic the sort of lengthy and holistic exam that psychiatrists would conduct at the Phipps clinic. The first 2 questions were rather open-ended. How has your health been on the whole? Do you have any particular health troubles at present? By allowing participants to describe their medical history in their own terms, these interviewers could establish a rapport with them and solicit a fuller picture of their current and former health status. They could then focus the conversation on certain conditions by turning to the next question. What sort of serious illnesses have you had? After this list of diseases was collected, the interviewer would follow up on each of them and ask whether it had impacted their ability to work. Specifically, by asking when the participants could work and for how long this had lasted, the interviewer could isolate the most disabling syndromes, allowing the Laytons and their colleagues to evaluate them according to the degree of maladjustment they had caused. Additions such as these might seem insignificant, but if we stop to examine how the responses to these items were analyzed in the records from the study, we can see how they shaped the production of data from Sterling County. On this form, for example, which is for a participant who is a 67-year-old woman, we learned that she had, quote, never been able to do the usual work of a woman, and that others, quote, found her to be frail. These functional deficiencies are reported alongside various psychosomatic complaints, including neuralgia, palpitations, and cold sweats. Toward the end of the form, however, we see that some conditions, like the neuralgia, are discarded entirely, as they were considered mild. Others, like the palpitations and cold sweats, have been grouped into a symptom pattern, anxiety. Collectively, these are associated with, but somewhat obscured by, the outcome of interest, which is the level of impairment. This was described as moderate, although interestingly, the patient herself reported that she did not have any particular physical trouble, to which the psychiatrist replied in the marginalia with an incredulous explanation. We see then that the question about work skewed the results of the HOS, as impairment was weighed more heavily than the presence of symptoms alone, psychiatric or otherwise. It became, in effect, an assessment of social adjustment, or more specifically, the capacity to recognize, or the capacity to engage and recognize labor. What's more, the symptoms would only be analyzed if they were detected by the HOS in the first place. As his study in the nearby counties progressed, Macmillan gradually narrowed the NSA, leaving only 20 questions from an original 70 that he thought best screened for mental illness. Now, he determined this by weighting every possible answer on the questionnaire as depicted on this table to the left. Using the question about work as an example, we see that an answer of sometimes was given a score of 6.7, while hardly ever and ever 13.9. These values were higher than those assigned to the question about palpitations, 0.9 and 0.6 respectively. But how did he arrive at those weights? In order to assign these weights to each question and its answers, Macmillan had to maximally differentiate the responses of a sick group to those of a well group. Establishing the former would be simple enough, although he knew that expert evaluation was somewhat unreliable based on the previous phase of the study. Macmillan could reasonably assume that participants that had been hospitalized were less healthy than those who had not. But how could he determine which sample of the population was the healthiest? Initially, Macmillan planned to hire a psychiatrist to assess the residents and establish this well group. But he soon realized, however, that there were only 6 psychiatrists in this area, and none of them had time to ride around in his trailer. He considered flying one in for elsewhere, but ultimately decided against this, as it take too long to familiarize them with the county and its culture. And so Macmillan devised an alternative plan. Like his colleagues in Sterling, Macmillan divided his county into strata based on socioeconomic characteristics. For the sake of expediency, however, he did so by collaborating with officials from the local Department of Agriculture, which resulted in the following categories: good farm, average farm, poor farm, and urban. You can see these highlighted on the map as well as in the title from the publication. Macmillan allowed these officials to establish his own criteria for the strata, which I've listed here on the left. These are actually from Macmillan's dissertation. Note how the quality of the land itself is prioritized, along with access to local services and amenities. After surveying each of these strata, though, Macmillan's team concluded that those residing in good farm, quote, set the standard for the entire area, not just economically, but, quote, politically and morally as well. And so Macmillan decided to use this sample as his well group, as they're not only the healthiest, but they seem best adjusted to the social setting described by his participants. He then contrasted their responses to those given by the patients in the hospital and assigned weights to each question so their differences would be as large as possible. And then based on these scores, he developed a cutting point that divided the sick from the healthy. So the HOS could then be used readily as a screening instrument in any population. And it certainly was. In the years that followed, the HOS was adapted for projects in various locations. One of these, which involved a national sample of American adults, eventually shaped the development of JFK's Community Mental Health Act. But by limiting their survey to these 20 questions, researchers and policymakers may have unintentionally adopted the Nova Scotian government's valuation of productivity. A similar thing could be said about Midtown's 22IS, which was also adapted from the military's NSA and included many of the same questions. It is the predecessor of this instrument and the controversy surrounding it that we turn to next. So like Macmillan, Rennie considered having a psychiatrist directly examine each of his participants in Manhattan. But after confronting the same methodological issues, he had his co-investigators develop their own screening questions. And we can see some of these here in a preliminary draft of the survey. You can't see the previous slide, but many of these are identical to those Macmillan chose in the HOS. And so it too screened for a wide array of somatic symptoms, but with an emphasis on those that contributed to psychosocial impairment. Indeed, like the Laytons, Rennie reviewed these responses with 2 of his colleagues, but not to diagnose the participants, but to evaluate their functional capacity. Using the scale pictured here, each psychiatrist developed an independent rating of a participant, based not only on the degree of impairment, which could range from adequate functioning to total incapacitation, but also on the severity of symptoms themselves, whether that be mild, moderate, or serious. Determining the latter was straightforward enough. Based on the items from the previous slide and their clinical expertise, the psychiatrist could identify a variety of common syndromes, or as they put it, symptom formations. Consider, for example, the case of a middle-aged businessman who presented with apparent misgivings about his capacities. The questionnaire revealed that he was often nervous and was worried about losing his friends in old age. All this had resulted in a number of psychosomatic symptoms, including headaches, insomnia, trembling hands, cold sweats, and dizziness. After reviewing these responses, along with notes taken on the respondent's behavior, both psychiatrists or judges agreed that he was seriously disturbed. They soon realized, however, that they could not provide a final score based on these data alone. Clearly, his symptoms were severe enough to justify a rating of 4 or higher, but without more information on his social functioning, they were unable to distinguish between these values. Of course, they could have taken a page from Macmillan's playbook and determined which of these questions best distinguished psychiatric patients from some sort of well group. And indeed, in the years following Rennie's death, a sociologist affiliated with the project would use similar procedures to narrow the 22 IS down to 22 questions. While he was alive, however, Rennie insisted that they look beyond the, quote, abstracted life of strictly drawn samples and punch cards and focus instead on persons in the ordinary mainstream of a community. To start, he collected data from each participant from the New York City Social Service Exchange, so his colleagues could evaluate their so-called life adjustment. In this case, at least, the results seem encouraging. The respondent was managing his own hardware store, which had allowed him to climb the socioeconomic ladder. And so, despite his near psychotic symptomatology, that's a quote, the psychiatrist could rate him no worse than 4, as he exhibited some degree of life adjustment. Now, some of Rennie's non-clinical staff objected to this interpretation. Chief among them was Marvin Oppler, an anthropologist that he had hired to lead the study of Midtown's ethnic minorities. Oppler's background is rather interesting. After conducting ethnographic research on indigenous communities in the American West, he, like many anthropologists of his generation, including Alex Layton, actually, worked as a community analyst for Japanese internment camps. But unlike many of his colleagues, Oppler became a very vocal critic of these institutions. This, combined with his involvement in left-wing organizations during college, attracted the attention of the FBI, which prevented him from receiving an endowed chair at Harvard after the war. Rennie was actually aware that Oppler had been blacklisted, but decided to recruit him anyway. It is not surprising then that Oppler developed an affinity for Rennie's particular brand of psychobiology and continued promoting it after Layton assumed control of the study. Take, for example, this excerpt from the project's 3rd volume, which was written by Oppler but never published. It was Dr. Rennie's feeling that such psychiatric ratings could be further checked only by added data from additional methods. These questionnaires, he continued, merely serve to assign a person in a rough fashion to some point in a continuum. In contrast, Oppler, and by implication, Rennie and Meyer, believed it was, quote, even more important to seek out relationships of such supposed degrees of adjustment to the cultural backgrounds of Midtown's residents. Oppler's criticism of the rating process is somewhat muted in his manuscript, but in a memo to Layton, however, he was far less diplomatic towards Stanley Michael, the psychiatrist who wrote those case histories I just summarized. I am particularly amazed, he wrote, at the repetition of socioeconomic, as opposed to sociocultural, with every conceivable noun. In an exasperated tone, Oppler questioned if Michael was even aware of the study's ethnographic aims. If not, he exclaimed, someone should review the matter with him, preferably not myself. He's even more direct in the marginalia, where he implores his colleague not to waste time, quote, reestablishing positions that he and Rennie had established years earlier. Layton attempted to resolve these and other disputes in the study by dividing the project entirely into new branches. The first of these was directed by a sociologist, but was supported by psychiatrists like Michael. And this ultimately led to the 22 IS, the symptom scale from the study. But the second was devoted to an analysis of sociocultural data, which Oppler directed. And at the beginning of this, he started by reviewing ethnographic literature on Midtown's ethnic minorities. Much of this focused on European groups like the Irish and Germans that had established communities in New York decades earlier. But in recent years, other groups like Puerto Ricans have begun relocating there as well, which attracted a lot of attention from anthropologists and social scientists. As he synthesized this literature using the outline picture here, Oppler paid particular attention to the family structures found in each culture and the gender roles enforced by them. These, like the individual migrants themselves, had changed upon arrival to the United States, often in unique and paradoxical ways. To understand how this acculturation process impacted mental health, Oppler and his field workers conducted follow-up interviews on select participants and assessed how their norms and values had shifted over time. So one of them, a 38-year-old woman from Puerto Rico, seemed well adjusted to life in New York. After her initial interview, the psychiatrist had given her a low rating, as she seemed to be functioning pretty adequately. Like the case presented previously, the final score was heavily influenced by her job history. Like many Puerto Rican women, she had found steady work in New York's garment industry and was able to support herself economically. This was not the case for many Puerto Rican men who were reluctant to take such jobs and experienced higher rates of unemployment. If the ethnographies of the time are to be believed, this situation was at odds with Puerto Rican divisions of labor, by which men were designated as breadwinners. According to Oppler, anyway, this contradiction had a broader ramification for the migrant community. Indeed, compared to the, quote, standards of conduct or conceptions of values in Puerto Rico, there was an obvious, quote, dislocation of the norm of the home-centered, early married female. But this does not mean that migrant women were no longer pressured to uphold these traditional values. In this case, the follow-up interview revealed that the, quote, respondent's social role was confused and unclear, as she was simultaneously satisfied by her financial independence, distressed by her inability to find a husband, and resentful of gender roles entirely, both in Puerto Rico and the United States. And so, despite her job continuity and good work orientation, that's a quote, Oppler's staff decided to change the participant score to a 3, as there was clearly some interference with her life adjustment from these cultural sources. This was just one of 50 cases they re-rated as they analyzed the results of the questionnaire from the previous study conducted by the psychiatrists. Many, like this one, impose cultural stereotypes on Midtown's most marginalized residents. But at the same time, they also drew attention away from the capacity of individual respondents and towards the structural factors that facilitated their adjustment. Regardless, Oppler never finished this manuscript, so these case histories and the sociocultural data that informed them remained unpublished. Those original ratings, in contrast, provided the basis of statistics that were presented in 2 other volumes, and these were cited frequently by researchers and journalists in the years that followed. So decades later, in fact, Alex Layton maintained that these measures of impairment, these ratings, or as he put them, measures of impairment risk, were the most important legacy of these studies and of psychobiology. So in the essay picture here, he and his partner, Jane Murphy, reintroduced their colleagues to Meyer and contrasted his approach to that of psychoanalysis and biological psychiatry. While Murphy and Layton understood that many of their colleagues in both psychiatry and epidemiology identified as partisans of one or the other, they insisted that psychobiological concepts were bringing clarity to both fields, even if they weren't acknowledged for doing so. This, they suggest, was reflected in DSM-4, which stipulated that syndromes could only be considered disorders if they result in, quote, significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas of functioning. Likening this criteria of impairment to Meyer's concept of maladjustment, Murphy and Layton argued that this increased emphasis on the patient's quality of life, in addition to their symptomatology, could result in a less ambiguous approach to nosology, epidemiology, and therapy. I'd be interested if any clinicians in the audience think this was achieved by subsequent revisions of the DSM. I suspect it wasn't. But even if a neo-Meyerian revolution has yet to pass in clinical psychiatry, measurements of impairment have already made a profound impact on public mental health. Ever since the Global Burden of Disease was first published in 1996, psychiatrists and epidemiologists have been able to secure more funding for their studies and interventions by pointing to the share of disability-adjusted life years, or DALYs, attributable to mental illnesses. Like symptom scales, DALYs bring our attention to a non-specific condition, disability, that can result in any number of diseases. On the chart pictured here, which presents data from 20 years after the initial study, so like around 2016, such psychiatric and neurological disorders are represented by light purple bars. Together with alcoholism and substance use disorders, these diagnoses are responsible for about 1/3 of DALYs worldwide. Now, proponents of psychiatric epidemiology and services frequently stress that this is equal to the amount caused by chronic somatic illnesses and more than that caused by infectious diseases, and rightfully so. That being said, some observers, like the sociologist Catherine Kenny, have criticized DALYs for redirecting health interventions towards the promotion of human capital. Such a perspective, they argue, devalues non-productive individuals, particularly in low-income countries, while ignoring many of the non-economic factors that contribute to physical, psychological, and social well-being. These critiques echo those made by Opler decades earlier. All too often, he wrote, these cold and impersonal statistics on impairment of groups gains at the expense of a relative neglect of the total family dynamics and of the cultural milieu from which the patients come. Quoting Rennie yet again, he called on his fellow social psychiatrists to turn their interests outward from the individual patient to the family, the community, and the total cultural scene. Opler's ethnographic approach is not a panacea, of course. As the psychiatrists Jonathan Metzl and Helena Hansen have argued, cultural competency alone will not resolve disparities in mental health. But having said that, I believe that Rennie's particular brand of psychobiology and the interdisciplinary research it inspires can inform structural interventions as well. In recent years, this has been exemplified, I think, by the historian Matt Smith's advocacy for UBI in Scotland, which grew out of his own project on social psychiatry. In a similar manner, I hope that my presentation and my research more broadly will help others recognize how psychobiology shaped the development of public mental health and scrutinize how maladjustment is operationalized today. Under the influence of Rennie, the Laytons, and others, many mid-century social scientists adapted psychobiological concepts and methods. And while this greatly expanded the scope of epidemiological research and allowed research to identify subclinical disorders in the community, it also led to what I have called the economization of public mental health. While anthropology and other human sciences have mitigated this to some extent, studies of culture can also be reductive and obscure the structural factors that drive inequality. And so as we continue to study the social determinants of mental health, we should stop to ask ourselves what precisely we mean by social. If we don't, we may replicate the shortcomings of our predecessors and impose our own definitions of adjustment upon others. That's all I have for you today. Here's a list of my sources. It's actually somewhat legible there, but if you like, I can send it to you as well. Before I wrap up, I just want to thank a few people, Christy, Larry, Bob, and the rest of the Corner Society for having me back. The Department of Psychiatry for co-sponsoring as well. All the staff and the volunteers who do all this work at the archives I referenced. None of this is possible without archivists. My advisors from grad school, Jeremy Green, Graham Mooney, McCall Ross, Angus Bergen, and Matt Smith, who I mentioned before, for sharing a lot of the archival material during COVID when I couldn't go to the archives. The Hugh Hawkins grant and the Bio Project for supporting my research. Also, just all my advisors from my undergrad. Hopefully you can see how a lot of my interest from undergrad ended up in this dissertation. It might not be obvious to others, but inspired me to do this research in a lot of ways. And all of you for taking the time to listen. I look forward to your questions. Yeah.
So this is working, yes. Okay, thank you so much, Michael. That was really, really rich, and I really appreciate how you've kind of drawn out all of these, all of these detailed surveys and explained it to us in super brilliant ways. So thank you. We have a bit of time for questions before we head to reception. So would anybody like to start us off? Otherwise, I can. This is for the folks in Scotland.
That was just a great talk. Thank you. Really, really fascinating history. I'm curious if you think at all the emphasis in part on functionality that continues. I mean, it's in the DSM-5.
Yeah.
It's pretty incoherent, I think, in just the ways you're describing, right? And symptoms and functionalism are sort of just thrown together.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about also perceptions of psychiatry outside of the discipline. And I say that in part because Engel, I think, for example, was very conscious of this, you know, whether or not it was really considered part and parcel of biomedicine in the 20th century. And I'm just kind of curious if some of the economization that you've described is related in part to that. I mean, if psychiatrists can do epidemiological studies that indicate that people are missing work, essentially, and they can try to measure economics, right, of that missed work, does it lend a certain legitimacy from a biomedical perspective to their discipline.
Yeah.
And that's different from like, I don't know if that's different than a different sort of question than what you were raising before, but I think I'm just curious if that's part of what's contributing to this emphasis on functionalism
Yeah.
and economics.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting because just thinking out loud a bit here, like I wouldn't be the first to say that like psychiatrists, particularly in the late 20th century, are very cognizant of, as they have in the whole history of the profession, of their like uneasy relationship with medicine. That's part of the reason they turn to like this, what the Kripalinian model with the DSM-3. But as you're pointing to in your question, like one way you can kind of gain, I think, authority or legitimacy in the medical community is by the biological focus, but also the functional focus. And that's why, starting with the DSM-4, we had this weird combination where it is just like Chinese menu of symptoms, but it has to cause dysfunction. And it's not, it's not always clear what dysfunction is. It's often perceived by the patient, which I think is ultimately good. You mentioned too, I think, I don't know if people pick up on this, but like, and it wouldn't be in this presentation, but in the dissertation, I use the economization of public mental health as kind of like a pun. It's both because there's this focus on economization as other sociologists describe this focus on the work capacity of the individuals, but also it's like economizing the methods and bringing them to scale. So what I try to show in this presentation is how methods used in a clinic, which can be, at a clinic, you could take much more time to understand the broad social context of the patient and like really try to apply that. When you're trying to study large populations like these psychiatrists are doing, they're leaving the clinic and going into the community. To bring that to scale, they economize, right, the methods and try to focus on in doing so, focus on a narrow set of social criteria, which often meant work. And I think it meant work because something I explore in the chapters on these that I don't have time for this talk is the 22IS in particular, but a lot of other symptom scales were also used by things like the Social Security Administration when they were doing all their reforms in the early 1970s about expanding rights, I think like SSDI, SSI, like those things. So they're using those tools, and it's not just, these tools not only give them more purchase with other physicians, to your point, and give them more legitimacy in the medical community, but I think with policymakers as well. I mentioned the Community Mental Health Act as well. So hope that answers your question. Yeah. Oh, sure.
As a community member and non-member of the medical community, I always question the subjective nature of the physician, the psychiatrist, and also patients in sharing information. And I think that creates, to me, a real point of concern. And that was demonstrated by the discrepancy in the Nova Scotia evaluation. And I think that trying to create these specific criterion is an attempt to get away from that, but I'm not sure it's possible.
The criteria you're saying are a way of getting away from
the subjective nature.
And not only the subjective nature, but like because of the subjectivity, the discord or the lack of I hear what you're saying. I think that's true. I certainly think like the neo-Kripalinians would have argued that for a lot of reasons. They're trying to make it more objective, whatever that means. But at the same time, I think, particularly with mental health, but I think health in general, like we don't want to lose. Health is more than just the symptomatology. Like we don't want to lose that focus on quality of life, I think. So I think the question is like, how do we find ways, both in like epidemiologic research, but also like in the clinic, to like kind of co-create criteria and co-create like our definition of the social, as I would put it. I think at DALYs you find an interesting way. I didn't have time for this in this talk, but like originally DALYs were constructed by this person trade-off method, which basically a bunch of experts would like imagine what it's like to I see, maybe people can explain this better than I, but they would imagine what it's like to have a disorder and like decide the quality of life based on that. I'm not explain that totally well, but they like evaluate how many years of life lost would be worth, right? I didn't do that very well. But anyway, but the point being is like experts were like imagining with prompts created by experts, like what the condition was like and creating data from that. since then, there's been a move, I think, to like co-create with like people with those disorders as well, which is like obviously very crucial. And you see that like when I took these classes on public mental health as well, there's an effort when it can creating scales for studies now. I think there's a more concerted effort to like interview patients or not patients, interview subjects in the community and like get their sense of all this before they create the like questions and criteria and stuff like that, which is not something you saw here. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Specifically, the young woman from
Yeah.
Puerto Rico who
Yeah.
demonstrated the capacity to work well and be financially independent, but then showed concerns about misogyny in her culture and in the United States. That's a reality, and yet she seemed to be reevaluated because of those concerns.
Yeah.
Which to me don't demonstrate mental health, and in fact the antithesis perhaps.
Yeah, no, that's why, and I try to like articulate this ambiguity I have about it in the presentation, but it's like on the one hand, what Opler's doing with incorporating ethnography is recognizing other sources of distress for the patient. And that's important. At the same time, it's pathologizing. It runs the risk certainly of pathologizing what is a social problem, which is the problem. Like that's a very fundamental issue in all of this, right? So I think that like that's why I try to say like it's not a panacea. It can be re-stigmatizing at the same time. Like there's a way such sociocultural analysis points to the structural in a way I think is important. But it's tricky business, I think. Yeah, like unpacking the social is much more complicated than it's hard enough to add social to biopsycho, but then you have to like unpack what social means, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I echo the question and concerns that was just voiced, and I think about the use of disability adjusted life years and sort of trying to fit mental health and psychiatry in the box of epidemiology, which was originally for infectious diseases and originally designed to try and measure the burden of disease that could be somewhat more objectively measured without the need for these kind of subjective scales with how do you weigh these questions? Is like there's vomiting, you know, there's issues related to infectious diseases. So I more so validating that concern, also acknowledging the time, the social situations of the time, but wondering if the principle of epidemiology is really the right format for addressing and measuring these issues, these metrics of maladjustment. What do we mean by maladjustment? And, you know, certainly focusing on communities and working class, while people who are in the upper 1% who may not even need to work are still experiencing these, and we have no idea what their burden of disease would be if you were to even use a kind of epidemiologic term. So I wonder, Michael, in your view, do you think the principles of epidemiology are appropriate for this kind of work? Should there be something in your mind that might be a better fit? And that's a hard question to answer. I'm notorious for hard questions.
No, it's a good one. It's making me remember how like I went to grad school thinking I had like find answers to the question, then I just left with like, wait, which is not surprising to anyone, but like it's something I struggle with. And I think it's actually my thoughts on this have evolved this year a lot as I've like been enmeshed in clinical medicine more, because I can see how something like the PHQ is so important, because it can capture like you can just capture people who don't even realize they're struggling really, or displace the struggling into something else. Like having these economized tools in the like second sense of like bringing it to scale, like you pointed out, like not everyone can afford a Freudian analyst to like really unpack everything. And so like having these tools to catch people who are really going through mental and social distress, I think are so valuable. The best answer I think I can come up with now is just like, I think it's worth wielding them very intentionally, because they do have these risks like we talked about. That's why I think history is really important here, because like you can like not like I showed Macmillan's research. He actually put good farm in the title there, but he didn't explain what that meant at all. Like I had to go into his dissertation and go to like the Cornell's basement to figure out what that meant. And with the Midtown study, I mentioned I didn't talk about that. I don't know how they define the well group, because it's not in the archive. But even with these limits, like I think history can like point us to like we can go back to these studies and really unpack what they were doing and see like, you know, when these scales were created, what were the criteria they were thinking about? Like, does that matter for how we're using this tool today? Or even better, like again, I mentioned like, and I'm glad I took these courses in epidemiology while I did this study because I could see how things are a little different now. And like, at least that my professors, like they talked about ways in which like you engage the community first and like community-based participatory research and like get them to like help co-create the questions. This is something I've done with Nancy Shin, an anthropologist here when we did field work as undergrads and in med school as well. So I think there's ways of doing this more intentionally and making sure like you're co-creating the social criteria, but at the same time, despite the limits and the reductionism of epidemiology, I do think it's, or not even epidemiology, but like symptom scales, screeners, like they're just so vitally important. And I think we lose a lot if we just like eschew them entirely, certainly. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience?
Hey.
Michael, if you allow, it's like 1.5 times everybody to have to do right.
One point.
One, it seems like psychiatry is inherently and historically focused in a bit of, so pardon me, an old-fashioned way of thinking about medicine.
Okay.
It's a social context. So one is going more towards objective measures, like something I'm interested in is functional neurosurgery. So looking at more neurobiological mechanisms and using newer methods of thinking about psychiatric diseases, incorporating those rather than just surveying subjective measurements into epidemiological models. And then kind of next point, you use the UBI at the end, which is very nice, but I guess epidemiology is usually used to inform like public health measurements and ways of actually applying them. So I guess as a burgeoning physician scientist, both as far as using like more objective measurements with that too, what interventions do you see through your work? I mean, it's one thing as a historian, but how do you take that to then propose for your patients in the future?
Yeah.
Like essentially public health interventions that address these issues or even just direct patient care. How do you think the things you study?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, part of the reason I think it's so valuable doing the MD PhD is like I have time to develop like what I think are like the more medical interventions. But I wouldn't like you mentioned UBI. I don't so clearly see the distinction there. So like Matt Smith, he was actually one of my grad advisors. And we look a lot at the same stuff, and we do differ in how we look at things a little bit. But like one thing I really admire about his work is he looks at these old studies and like his takeaway is that we basically demonstrated decades ago that poverty causes mental illness, and we can quibble about why, but we have all this evidence to suggest that just like providing people with basic like living standards would improve mental health significantly. And so his whole take on this stuff is like all these guys were like bickering over like scales and symptoms and all this stuff like that when they could have been like advocating in Congress and trying to get like people the basic social determinants of health that they need. So I wouldn't just like discount those social interventions. I think they're valuable. And that's why like DALYs are so, as Nick pointed to, like because they reveal to us the burden of disease that isn't so apparent from like traditional methods, like you can marshal that to get more resources for mental health care and things like that, which is what you saw with DALYs are one example in the global field, but like that's what we saw with the Community Mental Health Act with symptom scales. Symptom scales helped, like the HOS helped show policymakers like, oh, there's all this like mental health burden in the general population we weren't aware of. Let's create community mental health clinics, right? So I don't know if that answers your question at all. Yeah.
If there's one more question, we can take it. Otherwise, we can all thank Michael again for his brilliant talk. And there are snacks and wine over in the reception area, and you can bother Michael with more questions over there as well. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
We'll see you next month.
You like the comments like, I don't think